All right, welcome to week 3 as we talk about culture in the arena of sociology. The quote of the day, or the person I'm going to start this lecture with, is Ann Swidler. I had a chance to be in a conference with her. She has a strong tendency to value symbolic interactionism and has defined a large portion of what we do based on how we symbolically use our language. And so, as we talk about culture, one of the things that she reminds us is that the values or the ideas that we have about what we think is correct or right remain the major link between culture and action. And so, we'll align ourselves with culture that a lot of times aligns with the values, and we'll also interact with cultures and sometimes have differences of opinion or have difficulty sometimes understanding other cultures because some of those values or ideas about what we believe to be true or right or wrong, and the actions that go behind that are different. And so that's what we're going to shape the lecture today around. A lot of times when we think about culture, we think outside of ourselves and think about other places or other people. But we all have a culture, and we have to recognize that culture, something as a very real and true event that we never can say that we've been without. Our families have had culture, our communities, the way in which these areas of tradition and what we do as a connected group or groups is often expressed through what we define as culture. So what is the definition? The textbook is definition of culture is social beings that create it, and it acts as that agent of constant redefinition in society. It structures us. And so the text will help us first see that it's something that we create as what we call a social construct. It's not something that everybody creates in the same way. For example, driving on one side of the road. In England, there's a very strong culture that drives on the left side, and we in the United States and large portions of the world drive on the right side. Our language and the types of terms that we use, for example, you can tell about the culture in the United States about how people refer to soda, whether it's soda pop, Coke, whether they're talking about different types of Coke, Coca-Cola or cola. These all are definitions of culture, things that define us and kind of are in that background. Culture is also something that the theories, as we've studied them, express their ideas about culture differently. So, for example, going back to symbolic interaction, George Herbert Mead emphasized that the role of symbols and language were core elements of human interaction. And in fact, in raising children, it's very clear that each culture makes sure that those symbols make sense to the young people that they are raising, and the infants through all the way early adolescence and even into adulthood in different stages of life. And so that those symbols and those language define who that community is. It glues them together, and that those symbols become something that are very important. When you see the movie Baraka, you're going to see a lot of symbols, especially religious ones around the world, that are being expressed. What people see in the more modern industrialized world versus more tribal, and how those symbols interact, and that's something I invite you to consider. Another lens is functionalism. Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton introduced the function as a way of gluing society together. So again, going back to raising children in a culture, these functions can manifest in very clear ways where a child learns the function, for example, of right and wrong in a society, or a child learns the function of their role in doing chores to keep a household together, or they learn the function of how to do school and activities at school. And these functions can also have latent functions attached to them, meaning things that are lying underneath. For example, there's a lot of gendering still applied into different types of things that children learn based on their gender. There's a lot of times that clothing is an early activity that young children are invited to learn how to do. And a lot of times, even though we have a modern society that's challenging a lot of these things, we still see pink applied to girls and blue applied to boys, and the different types of styles. And the functionalist would look at that as something that tells them very specifically that they have a particular gender. And so, again, think about things whenever you think about manifest functions in life that you've been taught. Maybe you are going to school to become a doctor. That's something you're doing biology courses and going through all of this, and that's a very intended function. However, the unintended function is that in the long run, you're going to have a higher social status if you complete the program than your friend who is a teacher, who may also have to go through lots and lots of schooling to find themselves at a certain level. But at the same time, a doctor, by the time they're finished with their lifespan, tends to still have a higher status, at least in the United States, than a teacher. Now, that may be different in Europe and other places. Teachers have very high status. So once again, context and part of the world is important to keep in mind. Marxism looks at culture by the study of class conflict and how power and shared ideology is something that continues to find itself stressed in how the culture itself looks at equality. How are people treated? How is the culture built to either maintain that class conflict and have clear stratification that shows people of different classes having conflict over time based on that culture. Capitalism is a culture that Marx would look at very clearly, and especially certain types that continue to widen that gap. Whereas maybe places of socialism, or even like a country like Iceland, where you see it's very clear what they're making strides on how women and men are paid exactly the same amount based on their job, that would be a place of culture that Marx would look at, that class conflict being less of an issue. Feminism, of course, will always look at culture through the eyes of how women or unequal power due to gender is expressed. And so how does the culture look at women? How are especially young girls treated in that culture? And finally, postmodern theory is going to look at all the different perspectives and say what's going on culturally is not expected to be completely one truth, that it's actually part of society to have several different truths. And sometimes they can work together, sometimes they conflict. And so other theories kind of play into that. So when you look really at culture, the true definition, if you're going to be asked on a quiz and in our textbook, is the values that group members hold, the norms they follow, and the goods they create. So think about that for a second. Values are ideas, and we'll talk more about that next week, meaning that ideas are believed to be true, and these ideas are something that people have agreed that continue to be seen as the norm. That norm is something that everybody buys into, or at least a large portion of the group. Doesn't mean that everybody in the culture is going to follow the same exact role, but we do find that, for example, rural communities tend to have higher values and higher norm regulation based on the fact that they're more mechanical. Everybody working together in those small communities, because you don't have a ton of variation, is so important for those communities to stay together. Tones, who is a theorist, a European theorist, would often say that that was Gemeinschaft, which is this sense of being glued together by everybody trying to pitch in and do the same things and buy into those norms. But when you get into a more industrialized or urban area, you start to see what's more organic. People take for granted that there are lots of different roles that they don't even see that are making the city or the communities work. There's lots of bureaucracy, and you don't know everybody, and you just assume that everything is going to continue to go. That's part of the value, is that individualism, and that community's norms is that you're not going to know who is running everything, or necessarily know that other people know what you're doing to help that community continue. So that would be called Gemeinschaft, by the way, in German terms. The other thing is to consider the goods that both of those communities might create. An urban society might create a lot of technology, a lot of management, and you'll see a lot more high rises full of people in office jobs. Will also see manufacturers, a lot of times where people are working on plants on the outskirts of town, and the many roles that takes to manufacture food, manufacture automobiles. Whereas in the more rural areas or even some suburban areas, you see more folks having a lot more to do with creating something that's around the area. For example, think about the cattle that are in western Kansas and how ranchers know each other, or how people who are working farms know each other. And they create that good. They sometimes have associations with each other that create that culture because they have this one product or several products that are in the same field that they're trying to sell and make, and it shapes their whole life. So I know that sounds very material, but there's other things that we create sometimes. That we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we create not just material things, but the goods can also be a reputation or a status, or how people look at your town or your community. But we'll continue on, and we'll discover that throughout. Culture is not high society. It often gets associated, oh, that person is cultured. Well, that's not what we're talking about. And if you look at the video for this week, it will help you a little bit, especially on crash course. It's always something that is shaped by the community, but some communities have high standards of art. Others have more practical purposes for their goods and services, and that's a reflection of the people and their ideas, their norms, and what they choose to produce. It's not just material and sophisticated, and it is what binds groups together, and it is defined by a group of people and a majority of people, and can be changed over time. It is closely related to society and how that society sees itself. So as society changes, typically what we're seeing is culture changing. It's made up of values, and as I've said earlier, this is ideas, just ideas held by individuals and groups and thought to be real and true. For example, in the United States, we value individual freedom, meaning people being able to have self-sufficiency, a sense of their own agency that is built on sometimes what we call pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps. Now, we know that that's not necessarily always true. There are certain groups that have more resources and more ability to have connections that help them to succeed based on certain standards. But we also know that attached to that in the US, that individual freedom is valued highly by our culture. There are other parts of the world, and if you have international students that you've been present with, or if we have some in the class, where you see more communal freedom. And what that means is there's more communal connection in certain parts of the world, to not think about the full community and how your actions make an impact on the community and the family that you're part of. That would seem so strange to have full individual freedom, and that this is an important value. Social equality, religious authority, there's all kinds of values that will often be something that's part of our culture that we might not even think about on a regular basis. And values are more than abstract norms and material goods. They are ideas that govern our attitudes. So if somebody challenges your freedom, you may not really think that your culture helped you shape that idea. You may have thought, oh, that just makes perfect sense. But honestly, if you really look at it, you had to learn that attitude, and over time to buy into that. Think about the idea and the attitude about sex before marriage, for example. 50 years ago, a culture that talked about sex the way we do and cohabitation, the ideas that people choose to not get married, that would have seemed so strange to that community, because the values of that culture of the US, even though statistically we know people had sex before marriage, statistically we know that many people didn't get married, and still sex happened. But what the idea was is that the attitude about that in the culture was what was shaping our idea of what we should be doing. Stealing is something that, what we believe is stealing. And then today we can say, oh, it's highly valued not to steal, except when you look at people that get away with large scams and make lots of money, and they don't get treated as if they're criminals. I think about this with large institutions, and even if they do have some criminal prosecution, and they're often we use language that's much larger and more abstract, rather than just saying, hey, they stole a bunch of money through a scam that all of us fell for. Prostitution, another area and an attitude. Talking about prostitution in the culture of Kansas is going to be very different than talking about prostitution in the culture of Las Vegas or other parts of the world. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we mean values. Norms are rules and conduct that specify appropriate behavior, and that culture that we live in is given that range of social situations in which we practice these rules. We are given a space where either we see that prescription for allowing it or forbidding it. So, for example, saying bad language or saying something that would be considered crude when you're a young child, you're going to be challenged in lots of places because you probably hear other adults say some of those words. And yet, as a child, there is a forbidden action to that, because there's a certain age or agency that you're allowed to finally say that. Now, for some cultures, you're never allowed to say it, even if you know that other adults say it. But it's seen as a no-no, and it all depends on where you're raised. But we have to recognize that there's a platform out there for us to test that out. Just like when you touch the oven for the first time and you find out it's hot, you're touching the values of the community with some challenges, maybe as a young child or a teenager. And as you learn that, you're learning the norms or the expectations and the rules. Examples of that might be also monogamy and faithfulness in marriage. We know that that's a norm, or at least we expect that to be a norm, even though we know there's lots of people who are not monogamous or faithful in a marriage. Wearing shoes in public places, you see signs for that everywhere, even though a large portion of the world, the minute they get home, they take their shoes off, or it really doesn't hurt us that much to have shoes on or have shoes off. It's seen as a sign of what we do. We wear shoes, and you should have them on in particular times. So these are kinds of some of the things that make us who we are. Norms are those principles also that people are expected to observe, and we use the word proper a lot of times. And in functionalism especially, we see the words like proper and respectful until those functions are seen as something that need to be challenged. And then it goes usually based on dysfunctional behavior. Marx would say that proper is set by a certain class, and respect is set by a certain group of people in power. And so we have to continue to recognize that norms are defined, and they are often the do's and the don'ts of society. This is probably the easiest way to remember what a norm is. What are the things you do? What are the things you don't do? And I want you to take a moment to think about that for yourself. What is something that is a norm for the society that you live in? Even if you want to say the larger culture of the United States, but even think about where your hometown is. What are some of the things you do in your hometown? What are some of the things you don't? Think about what are some of the things you do in your family and some of the things you don't. And know that those are considered the norms. Material goods are those physical objects that a society creates that influence the way people live. And even though I said earlier that there are sometimes some abstracts to that, because we often will create goods that are what I would say is a reputation, in my opinion, is somewhat of a good. It's something that people can rely on to help them with power in society. We'll talk about that later. But we'll really talk about the culture itself. What do we make? Think about the United States. What is it that we make? Think about each state. Maybe let's think about what the difference is between what's made in California versus what's made in West Virginia. Difference in mining, difference in creating agriculture, Hollywood movies, and what do we make in Kansas? It can be food, transportation, housing, but these things shape usually the jobs that we do. And in an industrialized world, especially a capitalist one, we have a tendency to define ourselves based on the jobs that we have and what we do. Culture is also made up of beliefs. Beliefs are the end product of what we view to be normative, meaning we believe something to be true. When we believe in something, we recognize ourselves as people who have an idea about the whole aspect of our life, what we believe is true for where we're going in life, and what we believe about the actions that we're going to be taking. Without culture, people would not have meaning in their life, and usually that's what it provides, so that not only do we have a culture, but we believe because of that culture. We believe in things, and this doesn't have to be religious. This often is not religious. We just believe that our society is working the way it is, and we believe in the education system. We believe in the familial system. And even if we see things that are not what we would call typical, a lot of times that's the measurement we use is some sort of abstract idea of what the perfect ideal of a culture is. We measure it against what we know. But we also know that it changes over time. So I love this little picture of Snoopy saying, where am I going? What am I doing? What's the meaning of life? His culture of peanuts probably helped shape that a lot. I ask you these couple questions. How do differences in culture change us as social beings? So have you ever experienced a culture where you're like, that's something that's really cool. I really wish we would do that. And usually we do mean a we-ness when we say this rather than a me-ness. It's not just something we pick up on our own, but it's something that maybe our culture would appreciate more. For example, there's a lot of cultures that take a rest day in the middle of the afternoon, or rest time in the afternoon, called I just lost the word, a siesta, sorry. And the siesta can last sometimes for several hours. And then the culture will sometimes return to work until a late time at night. In the United States, we don't take siestas in the middle of the day. In fact, we are often challenged to work many hours in the day without any rest and have short lunch periods. So we might see a difference in a culture, and we might say, well, what would happen if we instituted that? And some small culture of your company or the place that you work might try on siesta based on some idea from another culture. Our attitudes are always determined culturally. Is that something you believe, or is that something that you think is true? I invite you to play around with that and maybe respond with that this week in your discussion. Once again, going to taboo as well. When we think about culture, there are certain things that are taboo. Once again, bringing up prostitution. In the United States and other parts of the world, prostitution is on the rise. It has been for a lot with the not only human trafficking, but we see prostitution all the way across the gamut with Las Vegas and other places, and legalization. So I want you to think about that. How is prostitution looked at culturally? What are some of the norms and values that we have? That why is it that on a bachelor night you're expected to have a stripper, or at least that's the typical norm? There's whole movies made about that bachelor party and somehow prostitution being involved, whether it's male or female, and yet it's taboo in the societal world to actually say that, and especially for large horrific reasons of seeing human trafficking, especially the sex trade with children and people who are abducted. So you have to think in terms of culture. what are we looking at, and how do people look at those taboos? And it's not just do's or don'ts, but it's also how do we blend that, and how do we bend those rules sometimes? We do this often as a society. Society is a large, huge idea if you really think about it. It is a group of people who typically live in a particular territory, so you can't necessarily say world society. I mean, I guess that's a particular territory, but we mean there's some sort of identification that you live in a particular place. You're subject to a common system of political authority, and you're aware of having a distinct identity from other groups. Society could be the society of your town or city. It can be a state. It can be a country. It can be also a group of people who live in a particular territory based on their sense of region. So, for example, the Great Plains. I often tell people we're not in the Midwest in Kansas. We're in the Great Plains. It's a very different ecosystem. And there's a difference in what we grow and how we do things. We don't have large urban areas that are as large as other parts of the Midwest. The Midwest has Chicago and Columbus and St. Louis, and we have Omaha and Wichita and parts of the Twin Cities, but they're not near the populous systems that are found in the Midwest. So, but then we also have tons of small towns that sometimes are grouped by counties. People know each other in counties sometimes as closely as they do in large cities. So society is something I want you to think about. What kind of society do you live in? But also, as I've said many times, serves as a glue because culture is an important part of conformity. Conforming to something helps us to sometimes know our North Star, and sometimes as we grow in age, and especially as you educate yourself and learn through school, that North Star might change based on ideas that you are starting to form with different communities and different cultures. There's a whole culture to college. And so we learn the norms of a culture at an early age, and they're internalized, and it makes them seem like they're normal at a later age. But sometimes when we see those norms or something that were for a particular culture, like let's think about same-sex marriage. You may have been raised in a community where you've never really been exposed to a gay couple, or you didn't know much about people and dating. And then suddenly you come to college and you experience a different culture of college, and you might break those rules of conformity that you had from your early life, and your culture may absorb that college educated experience. You might adopt that over and above, even though you still probably hold some of that respect for the culture that you've come from. And that's where we often ask the question, nature versus nurture. You are often raised to believe certain things, but is that something that just is intently part of our DNA, or is it something that we learn? And the sociologist will often focus on what's going on with the culture based on what you learn, not so much about the DNA. How much of our behaviors determined biology. There's a lot of people who say, well, it's very distinct for gender. Well, 1 in 20,000 children are born with different distinctive gender markers or sex markers. And I had a sister that was born XXY, and so she had Turner syndrome. These are things that may be part of our DNA, and it happens more often than we think. But instincts, reflexes in DNA can help in our understanding of the culture, but sociologists as a whole focus on the cultural side of a debate. Instead of the biological determinism of how we do things, we focus on how interaction with society shapes behavior based on our norms, values, and beliefs that each culture has. And so what we do in life, just because you're a boy or a girl, male, female, however we determine, race, ethnicity, all of these things, we look at that cultural side of what is describing those attributes. How have we taught about those things, and how do we continue to change and teach differently as we go through time? I often challenge people to think about this. 150 years ago, what would it look like for a person that is getting married to put so much time into the dress, so much time into creating a party, so much time into being able to do marriage counseling and have a sense of equality for the household. That would look completely strange to people from 150 years ago, where we had more arranged marriages, and a lot of times people were marrying economically, whereas now we work in a society that we've changed as a culture, that people want to have choice for who they're with, and they may not even get married. They may choose to cohabitate, or some folks have recognized maybe their sexuality is different, and so they may be asexual and never marry and don't want to be looked at any differently. So there's all kinds of norms and values that change over time, and as sociologists we have the fun of looking at that. I want you to take a moment to think about your upbringing. What did you start to identify with? For example, think about a political party. Have you always been the political party you are? And is that something that was shaped by your family? Did you have a choice? Did somebody teach you who you were? Was it instinctual? Or is it something that was shaped to where you had to believe that? I often make a joke about my history growing up. My dad was a Teamster truck driver, and so on the 1976 election, I was sent to school in a mostly Republican area with a Democrat donkey jumpsuit. And I didn't know as a kid, I just thought they were donkeys. I had no idea what was on my jumpsuit, but I had several kids that made fun of me because I wasn't wearing elephants or wasn't part of their party that they'd been growing up. That was when I was 7. So these are things that our parents do, and we do, and will do to our children if we choose to have them. So think about those things. Culture is a social construction, meaning all of us are making this up. Race, class, gender, all this stuff. We continue to define and add broad category to some of it. And as we continue to be a globalized world where we're online and we're seeing different cultures across the world, we're adopting a lot of that from other cultures. This means we ascribe certain characteristics to our own culture that make sense in the world in which we live. And as it makes sense, as the world continues to be one that where we interact on a larger scale with people that aren't necessarily directly in our community, we may see culture not be so much about a particular territory. As we've seen things like skater culture or rap culture or people who are into video games culture, all that kind of stuff is something that's newly being defined. And therefore, we have to think about subcultures. They exist within a mainstream culture, and they serve to socialize participants in the norms, values, and beliefs of that particular group. So as you think about a subculture, do you have particular music that you listen to? Is that associated? Or are you a person that is a skater or likes that culture? Are you a person that gets into some sort of group that might be involved in campus life? Some of you are on campus, and so you may be part of certain groups. Black Student Union or some sort of sorority. All of these are sub-context cultures. They're subcultures themselves where practices and norms and values dominate that particular area in that particular group. And it's up and against that dominant society and culture. And so a lot of times you find yourself assimilating, not only just to the larger society, but assimilating usually multiple times. So you'll assimilate to what is, for example, expected to be a United States citizen or United States, as we live in the US. We often use this for immigration, but I constantly tell people, you are constantly assimilating to what the culture is doing right now. And it's the acceptance of the minority group by the majority population, in which the new group takes on the values and norms of the dominant culture. So think about every 4 years, if we have different presidents taking office, and that shapes the culture, the group that lost or the group that is in the minority suddenly has to readapt and reassimilate. So that's something we have to keep in mind with assimilation. When you're in a sorority or a religious group, there's assimilation where you're accepted into it and you see that the norms and values are accepted by that majority, and you typically respect that. If you're choosing to be part of those groups, then you try to take on those values or norms, or at least try to do so at a level that you glue into that society. We also have to keep our eye out for when we are ethnocentric. Ethnocentrism is when we're judging other cultures in terms of standards of one's own meaning. When you start to judge some other culture based on what you think is right, then you may not be considering that that culture has years of history, like millennials years of history, that you are judging and you weren't raised there. A lot of times people will judge, for example, a woman wearing a hijab. I, on campus at K-State, have many classmates in my graduate department that are from the Middle East, and they wear the hijab. They don't see this as something that is taking away their individualism. In fact, they feel often that it heightens their ability to focus on their studies and not be seen as a piece of meat. Often what's taken out of context is that not only females wearing the hijab is judged, but often we forget that the men that typically are from the Middle East or Islamic, if they are religiously associated, will often themselves cover themselves completely with long sleeves and pants, and even the beard is considered some form of covering the face. So a lot of times that's different. We have a culture that, on the other hand, says, wear as short as shorts as you want. There may be certain areas to wear that. We're thinking about ourselves as having the individual right to dress and be whoever we want to be. But however, there's a lot of times where we judge people based on the amount of clothing they're wearing. And so we need to be aware of that ethnocentrism, especially when it comes to other nation states. This can misrepresent them, and it can also misrepresent you. You may not necessarily feel that way. It just is a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Instead, we look at cultural relativism as something being very important, where we consider and make judgments as sociologists of a society based on the own standards of the society. What's going on? What are their norms? What are their values? What is the material good that they are usually built around? Or what is the continued glue that makes the society work, and how can we evaluate and respect that? That is all I have on culture this time. I hope, again, if you have any questions, please text me 913-553-0267. I would love to hear if you have any questions or comments or anything that I can help with. Otherwise, I hope you have a good Labor Day weekend, and we'll talk to each other soon.